We have some more NHL news to discuss that includes some signings from UFAs, RFAs, a player returning from the KHL, and some news on potential buyouts as well. We'll jump into all the latest news coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a variety of NHL signings to talk about today and some updates here on buyout season, which is kind of slowly coming to an end here. But, of course, as we know, teams do get a second buyout window once they've had any players file for arbitration and all of their signings are thus completed. So the Vancouver Canucks are a team that falls into that category who recently completed all of their restricted free agent business after the Jake Virtanen signing, which was announced here just a couple nights ago. And then, of course, that gives them a 24-hour window to complete another buyout. Now, that window has come and essentially gone here, and we already had confirmation late yesterday that the Canucks had no intention of using that additional buyout window. Now, how the provisions work on the stipulations of that is that it had to be a contract of $4 million or more, and they had a 24-hour buyout window after that signing was announced to complete that kind of transaction. So they decided that they were not going to do that. Many people felt that Brandon Sutter was going to be a buyout candidate. Obviously, he makes over $4 million, had 1 year left. And obviously, the Canucks are a team who are really in desperate need of some salary cap space. So many felt that that would be a prime opportunity. Now, Louis Eriksson also makes more than $4 million, but in case you haven't heard me talk about it before, I mentioned it a few times, that contract to Louis Eriksson is essentially buyout proof. If they did a buyout on his contract now, they would only save about over $300,000 in cap space for the current year. They'd get a much bigger savings next year. And of course, how it works is you get 2/3 of the remaining money spread out over twice the amount of terms. So they'd have 4 more additional years tied on the books here to Louis Eriksson's contract. So if they wait another year, they would only be tied to it for 2 more years. After next year, it's a much bigger savings. They would save a lot more money. So Louis Eriksson will either play or find himself buried in the minors, which is the more likely scenario, given the fact that regardless of how they feel about Eriksson, what kind of training camp he has, they really need his contract buried for cap purposes, no matter what the link is to performance. So we will see how that goes. They are still actively looking for a trade, as is Eriksson and his agent, but at this point it seems quite unlikely. So it was a little bit of a surprise to hear that Sutter will not be bought out. I'm sure he was probably relieved by that news, but at the same time, another way they're likely going to create some cap space is it's sounding more and more likely that Michael Forsling could end up going on long-term injury reserve. Obviously, his health status is unknown at this time, and was being reported that the Canucks were going to be having a long talk with Forsling, looking at everything from a medical perspective here in the coming days, and we might have more clarity, I guess, on what the future holds for Forsling. If they can put him on LTIR and gain cap relief that way, then they don't technically have to move out any additional money to become cap compliant, which gives them basically the remainder of the offseason if they want to try and find other ways, gradually here to save any money or do any other little moves. They will have that option. Because the guys like Eriksson and Baertschi very well could end up being buried in the minors to get the necessary space, more flexibility, and we'll kind of go from there. But essentially, the Canucks appear to be pretty much done, barring some kind of unexpected trade. Now, at this point, the Canucks have been linked to a few different things that they are still looking to do, but obviously, we don't have any additional details. Now, we did get word that one of our signings is another Canuck player going to Calgary. So the Calgary Canucks, as we'll call them, have signed UFA forward Josh Leivo. Leivo only gets a 1-year deal at $875,000. The Calgary Canucks basically give him a 1-year deal on the fact that he didn't have a lot of leverage. He had some decent performances with Vancouver over parts of the last 2 years since he arrived from a trade with the Toronto Maple Leafs. When he first arrived, he had a pretty good showing, but this past year he only appeared in 36 games, and he put up 19 points. Like, he had a decent year, but he was injured a lot, and obviously that question mark on his health kind of took away pretty much any leverage he had, especially given how long of a stretch of a time he was out. He was not able to come back and play in the playoffs either, so he's been really on the shelf for an extended time, and he should be able to play a middle six or bottom six role in Calgary, and obviously give them a little bit of a extra punch here in the secondary scoring category. But yet another Canuck player goes to Calgary. He joins former teammates and defenseman Chris Tanev, goaltenders Jacob Markstrom, and Louis Domingue. Domingue likely will spend part of the time in the AHL, but will probably be their number 3 goaltender for the Flames. So obviously there's a mass exodus there of players that went from the Canucks to the Calgary Flames. So another interesting signing there. We'll see what Leivo can do. I think he still has a lot of potential. He's still relatively young, so we'll see how he fits in with the Flames organization. Now, the Calgary Flames also made another move, a little bit of a surprise. There was rumors about this player returning from the KHL before, but they did sign defenseman Nikita Nesterov to a one-year contract at league minimum $700,000. Now, of course, Nesterov played in the NHL previously. He's been over in the KHL for the last little while, though. There was some rumblings in the past, probably year to 2 years, really, more so last year, about him returning as we head into the 1920 NHL season. There was a lot of talk that he would sign and come back to the NHL. Of course, that never came to be. So he stayed over, played in the KHL for another season. So he'll join the Flames blue line. So, of course, they've had some interesting turnover there. We saw TJ Brodie leave via free agency and sign with the Leafs. Travis Hamonic has yet to re-sign, so we don't know where he's going to end up. He's been linked to Winnipeg, so there's certainly a lot of question marks on the Calgary Flames blue line. So Nikita Nesterov will be an interesting addition there. Obviously, we'll have to be relying heavily on some younger players like Anderson and Valimaki, along with Captain Mark Giordano. So we'll see how Nesterov's return to the NHL works out. The Carolina Hurricanes have re-signed restricted free agent defenseman Gustav Forsling on a one-year deal. Now, this is a pretty rich American Hockey League deal. It's a two-way deal, but his NHL salary is quite high. He gets $700K at the NHL level, but for his time in the AHL, he'll earn $250K, which is certainly one of the bigger AHL salaries. So clearly they feel Forsling is kind of a fringe borderline kind of player who they can see maybe splitting part of the season between the NHL and AHL depending on injuries and how he fares in training camp. We've seen some turnover on the Canes blue line, and there could possibly be more. They do have some other defensemen like a Jake Gardner, for example, who's been rumored in trade talks, but I know the Canes have not had any success in that regard. So we'll see what happens, but at least if he's playing in the AHL, he'll make a bigger amount of money. But he's certainly a player who they acquired previously, I believe, from the Chicago Blackhawks, who's kind of like a borderline player looking for an opportunity, and we'll see if he can stick with Carolina this coming season. Now, lastly here, we also have a pretty important restricted free agent signing with the Buffalo Sabres, and that's forward Sam Reinhart. Now, Reinhart avoids arbitration. He had filed for that, but they did come to terms here. They bridged the gap. Again, another case where we saw the player asking for a lot more than the team was offering, but like I said, that's pretty common here when it comes to arbitration, and they come to terms here on a $5.2 million one-year contract. So obviously Sam Reinhart will once again next season still be a restricted free agent forward. He's a pretty offensive guy, pretty consistent around that 55, 60 point mark. He can play center, he can play wing. He's certainly a pretty important piece in that Buffalo Sabres top six, especially with some different additions there, like a Taylor Hall, for example. It'll be interesting to see where exactly they put him in the lineup between guys like Hall and Skinner and Eichel and Eric Stahl. And, of course, a guy like Reinhart, I would imagine that the Buffalo Sabres top six area should be a lot stronger this year. And it'll be interesting to see how they all make out. I mean, guys like Reinhart and Hall especially are going to have a lot to prove after getting one-year contracts with the Sabres. A guy like Hall might find himself being, a prime player at the trade deadline that has a lot of interest if the Sabres are not in it. Reinhart, on the other hand, could find himself in that category, but I would think it's less likely given the fact that he'll still be a restricted free agent here next season when this is all said and done. But he's getting to that point where he's not too far off from being an unrestricted free agent, so we could see if they can come to terms on an extension. But when you sign a one-year contract, you can't then renegotiate an extension. Normally, it's when in January the 1st is what they go by. I don't know how that's going to work this year where the season is going to be running off of a different calendar, but it's usually right around that halfway point or so. So I would imagine it'll be a little while anyways before we can see these players sign extensions. So that is all your signings here for now. We're still waiting on players like Mike Hoffman and Granlund and still some other interesting players as well, like Anthony Duclair, that are still unsigned at this point. So it'll be interesting to see where they land. We'll be back with more information once we have more breaking news from around the NHL. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.